The goal of Explore the Iceberg is to become aware of your emotions with a goal of processing them and discerning God's will. I've been a pastor in a church since I was 25. Many of those years were spent not dealing with emotion. In fact, as a staff and in some of our training, we were told not to trust our feelings because they betray us. So rather than maturing in what we were feeling and processing those feelings in a healthy way, we heard things like, "You shouldn't feel that way." And don't let them see you cry from the pulpit because that is manipulative. Another one was, don't have friends in the church that you're a pastor of so that you can maintain your appearance and your distance. Have friends in other places. These were horrible lies. Some of you may remember the image of the train of belief. Facts were the big engine at the front that you could trust. Faith was next. And then feelings were in the back. Feelings were seen as the enemy. But we aren't wired like that in a logical progression. This led to a denying of feelings, even when they were pointing in the right direction. Throughout Scripture, God expresses a whole range of emotion. God feels. He created us to feel too. That's what makes us human. In Scripture, we find so many examples of people freely expressing themselves before God rather than medicating their pain, denying it, suppressing it. They pour it out before God. For example, we have David, a man after God's own heart. He expressed the full range of emotions from suicide to deep depression to rage to confusion to great joy. We have Job, who for 35 chapters, he's in anguish. He's angry, he's depressed, he's struggling. Then there's Jeremiah, a man of sorrows who wrote a whole book in the Bible called Lamentations. And then most importantly, think of Jesus. He shed tears. He was filled with joy. He felt overwhelmed with grief. He was angry. He was sorrowful. He was moved with compassion. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, we see a fully human Jesus, anguished, sorrowful, and spiritually overwhelmed. He's not an emotionally frozen Messiah. He's not shut down. So we have to ask ourselves, where did we get the idea that acknowledging and expressing authentic emotions isn't spiritual? Why do we believe that we can or somehow should grow in spiritual maturity without at the same time growing in emotional maturity? It's a tragedy, but so many Christians have divorced feelings from their spirituality. I know I did. It's generally pretty easy to express positive emotions like joy, enthusiasm, playfulness, but difficult to admit emotions such as sadness, disappointment, anger, and shame. Ecclesiastes 3 says there's a time to laugh and a time to cry. There are times when we're happy, and there's times for deep sadness. There will be times when we feel love and times when we feel hate. And an analogy that's used in emotionally healthy spirituality is the iceberg. 10% of an iceberg is above the surface and visible, while 90% is invisible and below the surface. The Titanic was fatally damaged by what was unseen. Human beings are like icebergs. 10% of us have, that's what people see on the surface. But it's what's unseen, it's below the surface that matters. Ken Burns, an American filmmaker, produced a documentary on Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd president of the United States. And Roosevelt's life has some important lessons for us about icebergs. Roosevelt was accomplished. He did a lot of good for the United States and the world with the creation of Social Security, the GI Bill, unemployment compensation. He preserved parks, and he had amazing leadership through World War II. But he wasn't a very integrated person. Who he was on the outside was not who he was on the inside. Roosevelt never showed pain, and he had plenty of it, both emotionally and physically. For one thing, he had polio, and it was extremely painful. He wore these braces all the time, and an aide once caught him grimacing in pain because of those braces, but when he saw his aide, he just stopped. His expression became neutral when she walked into the room. His family life was also really painful. He had a long affair with his wife's secretary. He and his wife, Eleanor, had no marriage, and their children rarely saw their father, and they felt abandoned by him. There were 19 divorces between his 5 children. Eleanor once said this about the state of the lives of her children. "When I think about my children, I want to commit suicide." Franklin Roosevelt died prematurely at 62 of a cerebral hemorrhage. And he was probably very unaware of his iceberg. That was what was going on inside of him. In particular, his feelings. When I first started to be aware of that I had feelings, I didn't know what to do with them. Lisa would ask me how things were on the inside, and I would always say, good. I first started thinking about feelings after reading a book that was trying to deal biblically with emotions. It's called I Felt God, I Think. Instead of ignoring my emotions, I started to explore them. We can do all sorts of things to avoid feelings. You can quit a job, you can go to another church, you can escape into pornography or other addictions, you can read more books, you can get new relationships, you can make more money, you can even pray or fast. But if you don't look inside of you, this is similar to just moving around the chairs on the Titanic to keep the ship from going down. As Jesus said, a bad tree cannot produce good fruit, and a good tree cannot produce bad fruit. So it's not what goes into a person that defiles him, but what comes out. And here are 3 truths about emotions. Unprocessed emotions don't die. Many of us are uncomfortable expressing certain feelings, so we find other ways to express them. Like it worried me sick, or it broke my heart, or something was a pain in the neck. But unprocessed emotions don't die. They get buried alive. Why? Because God created them to be paid attention to. If emotions aren't acknowledged properly, they will find a way to come out. They may go into your body in the form of insomnia, high blood pressure, panic attacks, cancer, irritable bowel syndrome, anxiety, weight gain, depression. Or they'll leak out with things like sarcasm, defensiveness, tears, and a host of other ways. Remember, emotions are like an internal GPS given by God to guide us, and we need to pay attention to them. Secondly, healthy community requires people to know themselves. We need to know our own feelings in order to love others well. We can't have authentic, healthy church communities without it. How can I enter your pain, your sadness, your hurt and your fear, or even your shame, if I don't enter my own? It's safe to say the extent to which I'm able to experience my own emotions is the extent to which I'm a loving person. Think about the implications of this for a small group. How am I going to tell you how I really am if I have no idea what's going on inside of me? The group goes around. How are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. So everybody's fine. But then our community, it's not really any different than the world around us. Think about it. How can the world know us if we don't know ourselves? And then thirdly, feelings help us discern God's voice. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, wrote a classic work 450 years ago on the important place of our emotions and discerning God's will. And this was in the context of complete commitment to God and to doing God's will, follow Scripture, and seek wise counsel. What do you think keeps us from progressing in the spiritual life? When more attention is given to our outer world, that is the things like tasks, programs, activities, at the expense of our inner world. We have an overdeveloped outer world and an underdeveloped inner world. So now we want to give you the opportunity to go beneath your iceberg and become aware of your emotional world. Turn to the instructions in your worksheet where you'll be asked to respond to 4 different questions.